There's a common misconception about healing from a narcissistic relationship, one that quietly sets people up for frustration months or even years into their recovery. It's the belief that healing is a single, unified process that once you've grieved enough, set enough boundaries, and gained enough clarity about what happened, you'll simply wake up one day fully repaired. This belief feels intuitive, but it doesn't match how healing actually unfolds because these relationships don't damage a single thing. They damage several distinct areas of a person's psychology simultaneously, each one requiring its own specific kind of attention, and healing one doesn't automatically heal the others. This is what we're exploring today, and I want to frame it clearly from the start, because it changes how you should think about your own progress. If you've ever felt confused about why you seem so much stronger in some areas of your life after leaving, while other areas still feel exactly as fragile as they did during the relationship itself, this isn't a contradiction, and it isn't evidence that you're doing something wrong. It's simply evidence that healing happens in distinct, separate territories, and progress in one doesn't automatically transfer to another. By the end of this, you'll have a clear map of 7 specific areas worth attending to deliberately, rather than assuming general time and general distance will eventually repair everything on its own. Let's start with the first area, because it's often the most obvious and yet, paradoxically, the one people rush past too quickly: grief. This sounds simple, almost too basic to need real explanations. But it's worth understanding precisely why grief after a narcissistic relationship differs from grief after an ordinary breakup, and why this difference matters for how it needs to be healed. Ordinary grief tends to mourn something relatively coherent, a real person, a real relationship, a shared future that existed and then ended. Grief after a narcissistic relationship is considerably more complicated, because it often involves mourning several things simultaneously, some of which were never actually real in the way they felt real at the time. You're grieving the relationship itself, certainly, but you're also grieving the version of that person you believed existed during the earliest, most idealized stages, a version that may have been largely performance rather than reality. You're grieving the future you'd imagined, one that was never actually going to arrive given the underlying pattern. And you're grieving something even harder to name: the time itself, the years spent in confusion, in self-doubt, in service to someone who wasn't offering anything close to equal investment in return. This layered grief needs space specifically because it's genuinely more complex than ordinary loss, and rushing past it, treating it as something to simply push through quickly, tends to leave pieces of it unprocessed, resurfacing unexpectedly months or years later in ways that feel confusing precisely because they seem disconnected from anything currently happening in your life. Healing this area specifically requires acknowledging all 3 layers of what's actually being grieved, rather than assuming that processing the ending of the relationship alone will resolve everything underneath it. This often means allowing yourself to grieve time itself, without shame, without the common but misguided belief that grieving lost years somehow means you're failing to appreciate the time you have left. So both things can be true simultaneously. You can genuinely value your present and future, while still needing to properly mourn a period of your life that was spent in a way you wouldn't have chosen with clearer eyes. Let's move to the second area, one that operates almost entirely separately from grief and requires its own distinct attention: self-trust, specifically your relationship with your own perception and memory. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about how these relationships erode confidence in your own read on reality, the subtle contesting of your memory, the redirection of your concerns, the gradual training that made you doubt your own instincts before anyone else even had the chance to challenge them. This damage doesn't heal simply because grief has been processed. It's a separate wound, requiring separate, deliberate repair. Healing this area typically requires actively practicing trust in your own perception in low-stakes situations, rebuilding the muscle gradually rather than expecting it to simply return on its own. This might mean noticing when you instinctively add a qualifier to an opinion you actually feel confident about and consciously removing it. It might mean noticing when you start to doubt a memory simply because someone else in your life, unrelated to the original relationship, expresses mild disagreements, and pausing to ask whether that doubt is proportionate or whether it's an old, conditioned reflex resurfacing in a new context. This area heals slowly, through repeated, deliberate practice, considerably more slowly than most people expect, and progress here often lags behind emotional healing in ways that can feel discouraging if you don't understand that these are genuinely separate processes. Let's talk about the third area, one we've touched on throughout other explorations in this series, but deserves specific attention here as its own distinct territory. It's your relationship with your own needs and boundaries. This is worth distinguishing carefully from self-trust, because while the two are related, they're not identical. Self-trust concerns whether you believe your own perception of events. This third area concerns something more behavioral, whether you actually know what you need, and whether you're willing to state and hold that need even when doing so creates friction. Years of a relationship structured around managing someone else's moods, prioritizing someone else's comforts, and minimizing your own needs to avoid triggering conflict tends to produce a genuine atrophy in this specific capacity. Many people leaving these relationships find that they've almost forgotten how to identify what they actually want in a given situation, because the habit of automatically calculating what would be least disruptive to someone else has become so deeply ingrained that it operates before conscious thought even has a chance to intervene. Healing this area requires deliberate practice too, starting often with small, low-stakes decisions, choosing a restaurant, stating a preference about how to spend an evening, and gradually building toward larger, more significant boundaries as the underlying capacity strengthens through repeated use. Let's introduce the fourth area, one that connects to something we discussed extensively throughout this series, but requires its own dedicated healing work separate from everything else we've covered so far. Your baseline expectation of what love and care are actually supposed to feel like. This is worth understanding as genuinely distinct from the first three areas, because it operates less like a specific wound and more like a distorted reference point. It's a calibration that got quietly reset during the relationship and now needs deliberate recalibration in order to accurately guide future relationships, whether romantic, platonic, or familial. Years of intermittent reinforcement, the cycle of coldness followed by disproportionate warmth we discussed extensively in earlier explorations, tends to reset what feels like enough affection. It's what feels like normal relational rhythm, what feels like acceptable treatment during conflict. Someone who has adjusted to this pattern for years can genuinely struggle afterward to recognize healthy consistency as sufficient, because it doesn't produce the same intensity of relief and reward that the old, unpredictable pattern once did. Healthy, stable affection can actually feel, at first, oddly flat or even slightly suspicious, simply because it doesn't match the internal template that years of intermittent reinforcement built. This recalibration is genuinely one of the harder areas to heal, precisely because it doesn't feel like healing while it's happening. It often feels like something is missing, like new, healthier relationships lack the intensity and excitement the old pattern reliably produced. Understanding this as a symptom of recalibration in progress, rather than as evidence that something is genuinely wrong with a new, healthier relationship, is crucial, because misreading this specific discomfort is one of the most common reasons people find themselves unconsciously drawn back toward familiar, unhealthy intensity, mistaking the absence of chaos for the absence of connection. What we haven't yet covered are the remaining three areas, each one revealing a different dimension of what actually needs deliberate attention after surviving this kind of relationship, moving from these foundational, individual repairs toward something considerably broader. How you relate to community, to your own body, and to your sense of meaning and purpose going forward. Understanding all 7 areas together, and understanding why treating them as separate, distinct territories rather than one single healing process actually makes recovery more achievable rather than more overwhelming, is exactly where we need to go next. Let's move into the 5th area, because it addresses something rarely discussed with enough seriousness in conversations about this kind of healing your relationship with your own body. This might seem disconnected from everything we've covered so far, which has focused primarily on psychological and relational territory, but the connection is worth understanding clearly, because sustained stress, hypervigilance, and chronic emotional suppression don't remain contained to the mind. They register physically, and healing from a narcissistic relationship that isn't also healing this area tends to remain incomplete in ways that are easy to overlook, precisely because the disconnect between mind and body doesn't always announce itself directly. Here's what this often looks like in practice. Years of monitoring someone else's moods, scanning for danger signals, holding tension in anticipation of conflict that might arrive without warning, tends to produce a nervous system that remains chronically activated long after the actual danger has passed. This might show up as difficulty relaxing even in genuinely safe situations, a persistent, low-grade restlessness that doesn't have an obvious external trigger, disrupted sleep, or a general sense of disconnection from physical sensation, as though the body has been operating on autopilot for so long that reconnecting with it feels unfamiliar or even uncomfortable. Some people describe this as feeling like they're watching their own life from slightly outside it, present but not fully inhabiting their physical experience. Healing this area requires deliberate attention to the body specifically, not simply addressing it as a side effect that will resolve once the psychological work is done. This might involve somatic therapy approaches specifically designed to help release stored tension, gentle movement practices that rebuild a sense of safety within your own physical experience, or simply consistent, patient attention to physical sensations throughout ordinary days, learning to notice hunger, fatigue, tension, and relaxation as valid, important information rather than background noise that gets ignored in favor of monitoring everyone else's emotional state. This area often gets the least attention of all 7, precisely because it's the least visible and the least directly connected to the relationship-specific content. But its absence from a healing process tends to leave a persistence, hard-to-name sense of incompleteness that no amount of psychological insight alone fully resolves. Let's talk about the 6th area, one that connects directly to something we discussed in Part 1 regarding isolation, but requires its own separate, deliberate attention: your relationship with community and social connection more broadly. Remember everything we've traced throughout this series about how these relationships tend to narrow a person's world over time, gradually reducing the circle of people who might offer outside perspective or simple, uncomplicated companionship. Leaving the relationship doesn't automatically restore this circle. And it's worth understanding why this specific healing work often requires more deliberate effort than people initially expect. Rebuilding social connection after a period of isolation involves more than simply reaching back out to old friends, though that's certainly part of it. It often requires relearning skills that atrophied during the relationship, the ability to be vulnerable without immediately monitoring how that vulnerability is being received, the capacity to trust new people at a healthy, moderate pace rather than either withholding trust entirely out of fear or extending it too quickly out of loneliness, and the willingness to tolerate the genuine awkwardness of rebuilding connections that may have grown distant during years of narrowed focus. This area also often involves grieving specific relationships that didn't survive the isolation, friendships that faded past the point of easy repair, family relationships that grew strained under the pressure of years of reduced contact, losses that deserve their own acknowledgement separate from the grief already discussed regarding the primary relationship itself. Healing this area matters enormously, not just for its own sake, but because genuine community functions as an ongoing protective factor against future harm. Remember everything we've traced throughout this series about how isolation makes people more vulnerable to exactly this kind of exploitation in the first place. A rebuilt, genuine social circle doesn't just provide comfort and connection for its own sake. It provides exactly the kind of outside perspective and reality. Checking that isolation specifically works to prevent, making it considerably harder for a similar dynamic to develop unnoticed in the future, should you ever encounter someone capable of attempting it again. Now let's talk about the 7th and final area, one that ties together everything we've discussed across this entire exploration into something considerably broader: your relationship with meaning and identity beyond the relationship itself. This is worth understanding as the deepest and often the slowest area to heal, because it involves something more fundamental than any single wound we've discussed so far. Many people who spend significant time in these relationships find that their sense of identity became quietly entangled with the relationship's demands, their interests narrowed to whatever the narcissist found acceptable, their sense of purpose reorganized around managing someone else's needs rather than pursuing their own. Healing this area involves genuine rediscovery, sometimes returning to interests and values that existed before the relationship began, sometimes discovering entirely new ones that never had room to develop while so much energy was directed elsewhere. This process can't be rushed, and it's worth understanding why it often takes considerably longer than the other 6 areas we've discussed. Identity and meaning aren't rebuilt through a single decision or a single deliberate practice. The way self-trust or boundary setting can be gradually strengthened through repeated small exercises. They emerge slowly through genuine exploration, through trying things without knowing in advance whether they'll matter, through the patient, sometimes frustrating process of rediscovering what you actually value when you're no longer organizing your entire life around someone else's approval. This brings us to the final part of this exploration, where we need to bring all 7 of these areas together into a coherent understanding, why treating them as distinct, separate territories, rather than expecting general time or general distance to heal everything simultaneously, actually makes the entire process more manageable rather than more overwhelming. And what this means for how you should think about your own healing journey going forward, especially if you've noticed, as many people do, that you seem considerably further along in some of these areas than in others. Let's bring all 7 areas together now, because understanding them as a complete map is what actually makes this entire healing process manageable rather than overwhelming. Grief, self-trust, boundaries and needs, recalibrated expectations of love, the body, community, and identity and meaning. These 7 areas don't heal on the same timeline, don't respond to the same interventions, and don't even necessarily begin healing at the same point in your recovery. Understanding this isn't discouraging information. It's actually the single most useful reframe available to anyone navigating this process. It's because it explains something that confuses almost everyone at some point along the way: the strange, uneven experience of feeling remarkably strong in one area while still feeling genuinely fragile in another, sometimes within the very same week. Here's why this unevenness happens, and why it's worth expecting rather than worrying about. Each of these 7 areas draws on different internal resources and responds to different kinds of attention. Grief tends to move through its own natural timeline, unfolding in waves that gradually decrease in intensity but rarely disappear in a single, linear progression. Self-trust and boundary setting respond well to deliberate, repeated practice. Small exercises performed consistently over time. Recalibrating your expectations of love often requires actually living inside healthier relationships long enough for a new template to genuinely take hold, which means this area can lag considerably behind the others, simply because it requires external circumstances, not just internal work, in order to fully develop. Healing your relationship with your body often requires specific, dedicated practices most people don't naturally think to include in their recovery, unless someone points toward their importance directly. Community rebuilds slowly through the passage of real-time and repeated, patient effort. And identity and meaning, the deepest and often slowest area of all, simply cannot be rushed, no matter how much conscious effort gets directed toward it. This means it's entirely normal, entirely expected, to find yourself considerably further along in, say, self-trust and boundary setting, while your relationship with your body remains almost entirely unaddressed, or to find your grief largely processed while your recalibrated expectations of love still haven't caught up. It's because you haven't yet had enough time inside a genuinely healthy relationship to fully retrain what enough actually feels like. None of this represents failure or incomplete healing in some overall sense. It represents the accurate, natural texture of a genuinely complex recovery process, one that was never going to unfold as a single, unified line moving steadily upward, but rather as 7 separate threads, each progressing at its own pace, each requiring its own specific kind of attention. Let's talk about what this means practically. It's because understanding this framework should change how you actually approach your own healing going forward. Rather than measuring your overall progress against a single, vague sense of "am I healed yet?" which tends to produce exactly the kind of discouragement and confusion so many people experience when healing doesn't feel uniform, it becomes considerably more useful to check in with each of these 7 areas individually, with real specificity. Where am I with grief right now, genuinely, not where I think I should be, but where I actually am? Where am I with trusting my own perception? Where am I with knowing and stating what I need? Where am I with recognizing healthy love is sufficient rather than instinctively wanting more intensity? Where am I with my relationship to my own body? Where am I with rebuilding genuine community? Where am I with rediscovering who I am and what actually matters to me, independent of anyone else's approval? So this kind of specific, honest inventory reveals something considerably more useful than a single, vague assessment ever could. It shows you exactly where your remaining work actually lies, which means you can direct your energy deliberately, rather than feeling generally unsettled without understanding why, or assuming that progress in one area should have automatically produced progress everywhere else. If you notice that grief feels largely settled, but your body still holds obvious tension you haven't yet addressed, that's genuinely useful information, pointing you towards somatic work specifically, rather than more general talk therapy that might already be serving other areas well, but isn't actually reaching this particular one. Here's the deepest insight worth carrying forward from everything we've traced across this entire exploration. Healing from a narcissistic relationship was never actually going to be a single achievement, a moment where you wake up one day and simply feel done. It was always going to be this 7 distinct, ongoing relationships with your own grief, your own perception, your own needs, your own understanding of love, your own body, your own community, and your own sense of meaning, each one requiring genuine, patient, sometimes uneven attention over considerable time. This isn't a discouraging way to understand recovery. It's actually the most honest and most ultimately hopeful way to understand it, because it means you don't need to wait for some single, complete transformation before you can recognize genuine progress. You can recognize it area by area, thread by thread, noticing real growth in self-trust even while grief still surfaces occasionally. Noticing real strengthening of boundaries even while your relationship with your body still needs dedicated attention you haven't yet given it. So if you've been measuring your own healing against some single, unified standard and feeling discouraged by how uneven it seems, let this be what you carry forward from everything we've explored today. You were never actually behind in some overall sense. You were simply further along in some of these 7 areas than others, which is exactly what real healing from something this complex actually looks like. There's no single finish line waiting at the end of this process, no specific day when all 7 threads suddenly align and complete themselves simultaneously. There's simply the ongoing, worthwhile work of attending to each one, patiently and specifically, building a life over time, where grief has been fully felt rather than avoided, where your own perception is trusted again, where your needs are known and stated without shame, where healthy love finally registers as enough, where your body feels like a safe place to live again, where genuine community surrounds you, and where your sense of who you are and what matters to you belongs entirely, finally, to yourself. That's not a single destination. It's 7 ongoing relationships, each one worth the patient, deliberate attention you're already learning, area by area, exactly how to give them.